There we go. Joanne, we just see the top of your head. There you go.
Getting there.
Okay. All right, let's go ahead and get this thing, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, thank you for joining us. My name is J.R. Gonzalez. I am with the TAMAC, the Texas Association of Mexican American Chambers of Commerce. And the reason for this video, this is going to be the start of hopefully an ongoing program, not only during the month of June, which we're wrapping up June, which is National Safety Month, but this is a situation that we need to address all year round. And the thing we're looking to address is safety in the workplace. Safety in the workplace is one of those subjects that doesn't sound real exciting or real sexy, but it is actually something that is very, very prevalent, and it is running, getting out of hand a little bit. And amongst the Latino community, it is something that we really need to address. Just to give you an example before we get started here to kind of set the table for everybody to understand what we're talking about. And this is according to statistics, and I'm sure the statistics, there's a lot of stuff that's missing. In 2017, we had 903 Latinos die on the job site. In 2018, 961, and in 2019, 1,088. Each year, more and more, the mortality rate amongst Latinos in the workplace is going up. This is something that, with everything being given, with all circumstances being even, it continues to rise. And this is something that TAMAC definitely wants to look at. We want to thank everybody for being on the call. Let's go ahead and introduce our panel. And Terry, we're going to go ahead and start off with you. And Terry, if you can just go ahead and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about what you do. And then we're going to go on to Joanne, and then Trooper Cockrell. And then we're going to have some discussion about this issue. So Terry, welcome.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I'm proud to be here representing the El Paso Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. I am the director of the MBDA Business Center here in El Paso. We've had that center through Commerce for 13 years, and I've been with this chamber for 20 years. So we work very closely with contractors and businesses, and this is definitely a topic near and dear to my heart. It is imperative that we show our businesses how to work safely. Those numbers are just not acceptable, and I'm happy to be part of today's discussion. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you. Joanne, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, this is Jo. Okay. Oh no.
We can hear you.
Okay. It was giving me messages. Okay. Hi, I'm Joanne Natarajan. I work for OSHA in the Austin office. I've been with OSHA since 1986. And for the last 21 years, I do the training and outreach for the Austin area office, meaning I do the speech requests, voluntary protection program audits, and manage our partnerships and alliances and answer technical questions.
Joanne, for those who may not know, could you please let us know what OSHA stands for?
OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and we regulate safety and health on the job in the United States and any of its territories. So,
and you're under the Department of Labor?
We are part of the Department of Labor, one agency of the Department of Labor. And what we do is if you are an employer and you have one or more employees, then the safety laws in the United States, and you're working in the United States, then our laws are something that you have to consider and comply with.
Okay, thank you very much. Our next person on the panel is going to be DPS Trooper, Sergeant Cockrell. Are you there, sir?
I am. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you. We don't see you yet.
Yeah, it keeps telling me that it's being blocked, but I've been with the Texas Department of Public Safety for about 26 years. I am currently the Media Communications Sergeant for Austin and 9 surrounding counties. When I'm not doing that, I'm also one of the safety education sergeants in the area to support the schools, communities, and whatnot. So basically my job, if I'm not dealing with the media, is to try to help out the community with safety education programs and presentations.
Thank you, sir. Sergeant, if you don't mind, just check your camera. And
I am. I have it on video on mine, but before it said the host had stopped it, or has it put it on?
Okay, we'll keep working on that from this end. But as we're looking at safety in the workplace, one of the things that we need to realize is there are some top safety concerns out there. And Joanne, you have an actual list, don't you, of the top safety concerns or the things that are occurring most often and where people are actually being injured and dying from?
Yes, I actually have a very short couple of slides on the top 10 for both construction and general industry.
Well,
Would
if you
you
don't
like
mind,
me to
yeah,
share
well, let's
that?
go through those real quick so we can at least kind of get an idea of what some of the issues are out there.
Okay. This won't take too long, but it's kind of the top 10, and we're gonna hop through them real quick. So if you are working in the United States and you have any of these hazards, you should try to control them so that workers do not die on the job. Number one is no fall protection in residential construction. Usually the times we see this is the most prevalent is when people are either setting the roof trusses or doing roofing. So in construction, all of construction, if a worker can fall more than 6 feet, the employer is required to use measures to prevent a fall. In this case, he's wearing a body harness and lanyard and is attached so he can't fall off the roof. Number two is no eye protection. We see in construction, people are usually required to wear safety glasses whenever you're handling a powered or hand tool. And when we do inspections, we find that unfortunately the safety glasses are not being worn. They're in somebody's pocket, in somebody's truck, but they're not worn. So they don't protect your eyes if they're not worn. Number three, training on fall hazards. Employers in construction are required to train workers on all hazards that they're going to be exposed to while doing construction. But we have a regulation that specifically requires training on fall hazards. So if workers are exposed to a fall of more than 6 feet, like these guys are working on the roof, then they have to be trained on where are fall hazards present and how are we going to protect people from falling. Number four, head protection. OSHA requires whenever there is a hazard to the head, in other words, you have people working above you that might drop tools and materials by mistake, or there's a load going overhead, the crane is operating, then people have to be wearing hard hats. And we find that sometimes they're not worn when they should be worn. Number five is on ladders. Whenever you have a ladder, like this extension ladder, it has to extend at least 3 foot above the upper level so that the person climbing the ladder has something to hold on to as they step off. Number six, unprotected edges with fall distances of greater than 6 feet. This is the same regulation as number one, essentially, only it's for everybody that's not in residential. So we find that there are a lot of people that are working, in this case, on a flat roof, and they can fall more than 6 feet off that edge, and there's nothing to prevent them. There's no guardrail up there, and they're not wearing a body harness lanyard. So something has to be done to keep them from falling off. Number seven, whenever you have an aerial lift, then the workers in that lift have to be wearing a body harness lanyard and be attached to the lift so that they can't fall out. Number eight, safe access on scaffolds. Whenever you have a scaffold that you've put up and the change in elevation is more than 18 inches, then you have to have some safe way for people to access the working level of the scaffold. Some scaffolds have built-in ladders on the end frames, or people can use a ladder and use that to access a level, but you're not allowed to be climbing the cross braces. That's not safe access. Number nine, when you have a scaffold that's more than 2 tiers tall or 10 feet tall, then you have to provide fall protection. And this is typically going to be cross braces and guardrails on the scaffold. Okay, so In this case, this is a kind of a job built ladder that somebody put together. I mean, a job built scaffold, and that's not compliant at all, but it also doesn't have fall protection. Number 10, when you put up a scaffold, you have to have a mid rail and a top rail to constitute a guardrail system. In this case, they're using the cross braces as probably the top rail or the equivalent of a top rail, but they still need a mid rail. So that's not a fully compliant scaffold either. So that's a quick tour of the top 10 in construction. We're going to do a similarly quick tour for the general industry. Number one most frequently cited in general industry is when a worker has an amputation, has an inpatient hospitalization due to a workplace incident, or a loss of an eye in the workplace, then employers are required to call OSHA within 24 hours and report that to OSHA. And so the number one most frequently cited is there are a lot of these incidences that are not being reported timely. And if you don't report timely, there's a statutory fine for that. Number 2 is Section 5A1 of the OSHA Act, which is a law we use when we do not have a specific regulation. So if it's not covered by any of our other regulations, we can cite Section 5A1, and it says that the employer has to provide a safe and healthy workplace to all workers. And we use this in cases where, for example, you have equipment or machinery, you've decided to modify it outside of the manufacturer's recommendations, and then somebody is seriously injured or killed. That's when we cite that. Number 3 is on hazard communication. And that is a regulation that requires employers to inform workers of the hazards of the chemicals that they're using, to obtain safety data sheets, provide training, and ensure in-plant labeling of containers. And we find that we still find people do not have a written program for that. Number 4, machine guarding. Essentially, if you have moving equipment or machinery in your place of business that can injure people or amputate fingers or other body parts, you have to guard it to prevent employee contact. And number 5, aisles and passageways. So when you have a warehouse type situation and you have moving equipment like forklifts, you are supposed to designate where are the aisles for those. You can see in the photo that the person has a partial aisle marking there, might need to be restriped, but there should be designated places for both equipment to move and people to move. Number 6, listing and labeling of electrical equipment. We find frequently what people do is they go and they buy the parts and pieces to make things up at the big box store. And what they do is they start wiring their own junction boxes. Okay. And that basically violates the approval for that equipment, which means that it can be electrically unsafe and give people electrical shock. So we say you have to use listed and labeled equipment. And it's listed and labeled as a unit, as a whole set, not, parts might be, but when you put them together, that collection of things you've put together is not listed and labeled. So that's a violation. Guarding unprotected edges where you can fall more than 4 feet. In this case, this is a loading dock. Most loading docks are right under 4 feet tall. But if you have a drop at an edge anywhere in your facility where someone can fall 4 feet or more, you have to guard against it. Typically, you're going to use a guardrail. That's why almost all loading docks are 4 feet or lower. Number 8, fit testing for respirators. Whenever you hand out respirators to do a job task, if you make it mandatory that workers wear respirators for particular job tasks, you have to fit test the respirator to make sure that it fits the person, because they come in all different shapes and sizes and configurations. And you want to you want the respirator that you've told them to wear to actually protect them. So that's why fit testing. Number 9, guarding the point of operation. We had earlier one on general machine guarding. We also have a specific law that says where the work is actually taking place, such as the saw on the saw blade, which cuts the material, you have to guard that against contact as well. And number 10, worker fatalities were not reported within 8 hours to OSHA. So whenever a worker dies on the job, the employer is required to report that fatality within 8 hours to the closest OSHA office. And that is all I have.
John, thank you very much. I do have a question for you. The statistics that you're looking at, this is incumbent on employers actually reporting to OSHA. So how many times are things not reported? And is that an issue in your data?
I will say it, well, it is an issue to some extent. Typically we hear about them. There are occasions where we don't hear about them timely. And what can happen is we can wind up hearing about it from a media report. In other words, a news, we might hear it on the news, and it's one that we're not aware of. So then we initiate an inspection. And there are occasionally ones where we get inquiries from attorneys that represent the victim's family that are asking for copies of our case file. And we were not aware of the fatality. So at that point, that's another way that we wind up finding out. But usually we find out about most of them. And in fact, in our area, I'm based in Austin, but we've had enough contact with a lot of the local police departments that they will contact us. Their dispatcher will contact us when they have a fatality that's local and report it that way as well. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them.
Well, I couldn't help to notice that number 10 was actually listed as people not reporting deaths or fatalities within 8 hours. So is it possible on some of these work sites, people may be injured and then maybe die later on because of a complication or because of injury, and those not being reported as well?
I would say yes. What happens is the employer, if the worker dies within 30 days of the workplace incident, then those are required to be reported to OSHA. If they die 31 days or more, the employer is not required to call us.
Okay.
So we do get a few of those.
So Jan, would it be safe to say that the statistics that I talked about earlier, as far as the fatalities of Latino workers, that they may be an undercount and there's possibly a lot more that are actually dying on the job that goes unreported?
That's probably true. And you have to understand that most of those numbers that are being reported do not capture occupational disease deaths, like workers that contract silicosis over years and years of being exposed to products that contain silica, like concretes, anything that has sand in it has silica. And occupational illness diseases are widely unreported. I mean, they estimate, the last estimate I read, and this was a long time ago, was probably between 50 and 70,000 deaths a year in the United States.
And
due to occupational disease.
And of course, that would not include COVID deaths either, would it? John, one more time.
Yes.
You're muted.
But right, we are doing COVID fatality inspections. So there may or may not, all of those may not be reported. Most of them, we're getting some of them. I don't know if we're getting all of them.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. That's very enlightening, and it's really interesting to see that those top 10 violations that cause injuries and death, and of course, the top 10 where you have violations that are actually written. Now, this video is going to be posted on the TMOC website for a period of time, and people are going to be able to reference it. But is it safe to say that, or not safe to say, employers have certain responsibilities, but the employees also have the right to pick up the phone and call if they see something is not safe or they're concerned for their own safety?
That's correct. Employers have the obligation to protect workers on the job and comply with OSHA regulations. Employees have the right to ask questions about safety and health on the job, and actually complain to their employer about safety and health, and they have the right to complain to OSHA as well. And employees are not, you cannot discriminate against workers for exercising their rights under the OSHA Act.
And are those lines set up where an employee can complain in different languages? Do you have lines where a Spanish speaker or somebody who may speak a different language can actually
Oh,
call
yeah.
in and report?
Well, what happens is if I'd say almost all the complaints we get are by phone. What happens is the worker calls our office and we'll take their name and number and then we'll call them back. We have an interpreter service for any language, but we do have we have several people that do speak Spanish in our office. If they're available, they take the call. If not, we have a language interpreter service and we call them back, and it's like a three-way conference call to take their complaint.
Okay. Super. Well, John, thank you very much. Do stand by. We may come back here in a little bit. Sergeant Cockrell, good to see you on the screen, sir. We're going to go ahead and switch over to you. And the reason we had you on the call is that one of the things we recognize throughout is that traffic fatalities are extremely high. And OSHA and DOL do not necessarily count those in some of those things, in some of their statistics. So Sergeant, can you give us a little rundown about what's going on out there in the streets and how many people are actually being killed in work-related and traffic type conditions there on the job?
So it's hard to be specific if somebody was leaving work, going to work, but we can keep track sometimes if it's a commercial motor vehicle that's involved in a crash. But we have seen in the past, and especially when I worked down south in the oil field area and industry, a lot of it's from fatigue and a lot of it's from basically angry drivers. We have some people that just want to get there first and want to get there fast. And sometimes they're used to getting someplace in 30 minutes because the traffic's going to take a little longer. So they're a little bit more aggressive. So we advise, most people, hey, plan that extra 10 or 15 minutes in whatever direction you're going or wherever you're going, because driving 70 miles an hour as opposed to 60 miles an hour is only going to get you there 2 or 3 minutes faster, but increase the risk of having crashes. So the biggest thing also is seatbelts. I think like 45% of all the fatalities that occurred, people still weren't wearing seatbelts. Now we do see more compliance, people day to day throughout the day wearing their seatbelts, but we are finding that many of these crashes, and I think about 51% of them are happening in rural areas, either people going home or just people traveling long distances. They're getting a crash where they run off the road or traveling too fast around a corner. That's a lot of what I'm seeing in some of the outer areas of Austin, people just driving too fast on rural roads. And one of the things we as Texans don't take into account a lot of times is the weather, especially when we had this past February, the snow. There were more accidents in one day than the officers could respond to. So we're asking people, and basically the safest way is to drive slower and not be so aggressive. Sometimes people get cut off and they take it personal. Sometimes I've cut people off and I'm like, oops, I'm sorry. Doesn't mean that I was trying to do it personally. So sleep, distraction, and attitude are 3 things that people can control when they get behind the wheel. And as a company, if you have that logo on the side of your door, on the back of your van, you're a target. If you go out there and do something that violates the law, traveling too fast or hit another vehicle, a lot of times, you can see the commercials from law firms. People come after corporations that have a big name because of the high dollar issues. So biggest thing again, especially workers, if they're working extra times, overshifts, or getting off late at night, they need to be careful driving at night and make sure they have plenty of rest. That's our biggest issue. But traffic fatalities, believe it or not, are up. Even with COVID last year, there were less drivers on the road, but more fatalities. So these are things that aren't happening just because of the number of motorists on the road. It's how they're driving. Speed was up. People were driving faster because there were less cars on the road. And now they're back to where there's traffic. So they're being more aggressive to get to the same place in the same amount of time they used to do when there was less traffic on the road.
Interesting. So traffic fatalities are up even during a time when there was lower traffic on the road.
So I missed the first part of your question, but during the 2020 period, you could see that most people stayed home because the business and the roads were a lot more open. I'd never seen roads as clear on 35 in Austin, but believe it or not, nationwide, the number of fatalities went up in 2020 when we had people stay home. But you could also see that people are driving faster on the roadways because there's less traffic. That may be also an indicator of some of the crashes that occurred that probably wouldn't have been fatalities. But we can see that the trend went up in 2020 from 2019 on the number of fatalities, even though we had less people on the roadway.
Okay. You mentioned sleep, attitude, and distractions. So distractions, are cell phones still one of the number one distractions for a driver, or is there something else out there?
Yeah, I think we all can see that. I think we just pass a car, and about every second or third car, you can see somebody either glancing at their phone or looking at a message or sending stuff. I do understand when people want to use their GPS to glance over, but we're still seeing a number of people that are using their phones, whether they're actively using it to send a message, respond, or just to look at the screen because they got things. One of the biggest things we teach teen drivers is to tell their parents, don't text your child when you know your child's going from one place or another. If you're an employee and you know your driver is driving somewhere and you want to send him a message, he's going to feel obligated to check it and read that message because it came from his employer. So we try to tell people, hey, stay off the phone. I have two phones for work, and my personal, I have to put mine in the center console because I know it's going to ring. And just like everybody else, you have that habit to look over to the side when it vibrates or it rings. So that's the biggest distraction, Then there's complacency. A lot of times we're not looking when we change lanes or watching out for, the other drivers. But I think distractions are probably a larger number than what gets reported on the fender benders, the running into the back of the car at the light or switching lanes, because you can see and I can see when we look to the right and we look to the left, there's a lot of people still on their phones.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Sergeant. And you as well, just stand by and we may have some questions here around. I'd like to go to Ms. Terry Reed out of the El Paso Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Terry has not only been with the organization for a long period of time, but is a wealth of information. Terry, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Working with our construction contractors very closely, especially through COVID and when it was at its height in our community last year, we found out a lot about safety or lack of safety in the workplace. And some of our contractors really came through as shining stars. So this is what we learned from them. So number one, we learned it's important to ensure a culture of safety in your business. It's clear and understood that safety is a priority and there is a zero tolerance for non-compliance. Many men, including Latino men, feel that they don't need a lot of regulations to be able to take care of themselves. We've heard this time and time again from our contractors out in the field. Have a safety process or manual in place in English or any prevalent language. You made that point a few minutes ago, JR, about the importance of having it in Spanish or whatever the prevalent language is in order to give them a fighting chance to know what that safety requirement is. Other countries and immigrants believe that America has an obsession with safety, but they don't necessarily have the same safety conditions in their countries. And so coming over here and working in an environment that is so different is it's tough on them in a lot of cases. Another point is provide that internal training, again, in their prevalent languages. Latino workers typically will be much better prepared after having training based on the risks and consequences, not so much the rules. they're more willing to follow those rules because that's a way to make sure they get back home to their families every night. It's part of the culture, and I think it's important that we understand that. Another good motivator is that people protected with safety gear work faster and can potentially earn more for their time. So this becomes another very positive impact for the family, more income production, and that makes it more of a priority to our Latino workers. Businesses need to have safety equipment available. We found that in some cases where COVID cases were spreading, we found that the businesses weren't necessarily making the PPEs available. They were leaving that up to their employees. So it is most effective to show reasons why something should or should not be done. I think it's also important that in the United States, they need to know that they have to follow the safety instructions on the tools and machinery, because that closely resembles what they need to do to protect themselves. We need to be consistent with safety processes. Having a consequence for those not following the process or working unsafely, and an incentive when they are staying consistent. In some of our cases, it was, buying lunch for everybody if they went a week without having any safety issues or anything happening on the sites. So that is very important as well. Having a safety officer in place and visiting the job site. Latin Americans have developed a survival system that does not necessarily depend on the legal system or corporate goodwill. Workers follow the instructions of people that they trust and that have experience for a particular task. And they follow suggestions that make sense to them. We found that it was very important for our contracting job sites to have surprise visits and surprise inspections by safety officers. And that's when they realized, like, they were clicking together and eating lunch with no masks on, or working very, very closely in very tight conditions. It isn't always going to be where they can work 6 feet apart, but they were able to be on site, see how they were working, and offer some really good solutions for being able to keep them safe. Providing a forum to voice grievances, that was brought up a little while ago as well. It's very important that they feel that they can be heard, that they can talk without retribution, without getting in trouble. If they feel that there's something unsafe going on at the work site, or it's being not seen or maybe even ignored by the business owner. And send your employees to training sessions that are provided in the community. I know that as a Hispanic chamber, we work very closely with OSHA to make sure that our chamber members and clients know when the trainings are. They have the 10-hour, they have the 30-hour. There are costs to it, but that's a cost of doing business. And we need to make it mandatory, not just a good faith effort for our employees to participate in that. So those were our top recommendations when it comes to workplace safety for our construction contractors.
Wow, thank you very much. It was very, very enlightening. In fact, I'll get with you afterwards and you can send that list of your findings over to us so we can get that posted and distributed amongst our membership. One of the things that, Terry, I heard you say is that us Latino men, the whole machismo kind of kicks in, and we don't want to go to a doctor. We don't want to do it this way. We want to do it our way.
Mm.
But at the same time, you did say something that resonated very well, is that as Latinos, we tend to trust or at least follow instructions of people that we trust and who have done it before and maybe have been able to do it in a better way. So that's some good tips out there for some folks. What I'd like to do at this time, guys, is just kind of open it up to the panelists and just kind of any comments. This is a situation. Oh, it's a problem. It's a problem of injuries and mortalities. The fact, with everything being even the fact that Latino workers are dying at a higher rate. It's also stands to reason that when it comes to the construction industry, there are a lot more Latino workers out there than any other segment. But two, safety is not just on construction sites, it's at home, it's in the office, it's driving on the streets, it's everywhere you go. So we're looking at how can we become a safer community and maybe overcome some of those resistances or some of those things of not wanting to cooperate or follow the rules. So I'm just kind of throwing it out there for anybody. And Terry, I'm going to start with you since you've had some good feedback on this. Is there anything we can do or change, or some of the things or some best practices you see that others can maybe implement to try to get a behavioral change of some of our workers to be a little bit more safe on the job site?
Well, I think it goes back to the first point I made about ensuring a culture of safety. I think it has to start and end at the business. It needs to be throughout every single thing that they do. It can't be something that, you know, hey, when the inspector is here, then you need to wear your safety equipment. It can't be that culture in the business. It needs to be from the very get-go, and they need to know there's a zero tolerance for not complying. If they need to be written up, if they need to whatever, I mean, hopefully it doesn't go that far, but it just, I believe it needs to be clear and understood that safety is priority. We're going to do the very best we can. We're going to provide you with all the tools you need to be able to work safely. Put it on a wall. I mean, I've seen them here. Hey, we've gone 1,000 days without any workforce injuries. I think it's important that they know we're tracking that the business is working toward no injuries. I mean, it's in the best interest of not only the workers, but of everybody, the families, the business. I just think it has to be clear from the very beginning, and everybody has to sign on. They have to know that.
So there needs to be consequences.
I believe so.
Okay. Sergeant Cockrell, do you have any suggestions or anything that you see as best practices or something that maybe could improve people's safety out there?
Well, I think many of y'all said, you know, it needs to be addressed, whether it's with signage, whether it's with meeting, and even like she said, you know, hey, if they do a good job, show them, you know, have a luncheon or something to show that, hey, we are noticing that you are doing the things that we've asked for. One thing you just said right now actually struck a chord, the machismo. You know, a lot of times men don't want to give up their position or their power or what they can and can't do. And I'll give you an example. So when I worked the road, a lot of times we would stop the driver, and that's not just Hispanic men, but just men in general. A lot of times we would arrest the driver for being intoxicated, and the wife, girlfriend, or even male partner next to him was sober enough to drive. They just didn't want to give up the keys and let their partner drive. So we have nothing against celebrating. We have nothing against drinking. We just have an issue with drinking and driving while you're intoxicated. So that's one of the big things we see, you know, happy hour where people go out, it's their vehicle, they're going to drive it home when maybe they should have let somebody else.
So is there a fine line between machismoism and stupidity there, Sergeant?
Well, you know, sometimes no, sometimes no. Sometimes our ego and our arrogance sits there, you know. In my career, I can't tell you how many times where somebody tells me I'm not too drunk to drive. I'm like, well, what's too drunk to drive? You know, if you're drunk, you're drunk. And many times, on many occasions, we've let the passenger drive the vehicle home when they were sober or able to operate that vehicle safely.
Well, the smart thing to do, and saves you a lot of paperwork too. Joanne, let's go over to you, ma'am. Do you have any comments or best practices, suggestions in your arena that you'd like to recommend to the folks?
Well, the employer's obligation is to comply with the OSHA laws. And actually you have to, as an employer, you have to enforce those laws. So if people tell you they don't want to do it, you have to have a disciplinary action program to deal with people that for whatever reason decide they don't want to wear safety glasses or they don't want to wear fall protection. So part of being an employer is you have the power and the control and you have to exercise it. Obviously, the best way to get people to comply with what you want them to do is to incentivize the actions that you want. In other words, if you have a job site and nobody's gotten injured on the job site in the last month, treating them to lunch is a good way to incentivize to some extent, as long as it's not an incentive that will discourage people from reporting things. The other thing is you can reward people for reporting hazards. A lot of good construction sites, what they'll do is everybody that's reported a hazard that's been corrected and therefore prevented somebody else from being injured, maybe all of the names of all those people get put in a hat at the end of the month, and so you draw a name and that person gets a $25 gift card to the grocery store or something. You want to incentivize those behaviors that get ahead of problems rather than waiting for an injury to occur and then having to do an accident investigation and try and figure out, well, how are we not going to have another one? But if you correct the hazard before that, then that's what you need to do. In other words, find the hazard, fix the hazard before anyone becomes injured.
I think these are all great suggestions. And from my part, it seems like another thing that we need to do, not only as community leaders and members of different organizations, is education, education, and education. As I said in the beginning, safety, job safety is not necessarily one of those sexy subjects that people just line up to listen to and find out more information about, but it is something that literally can save your life. So that's one of the things we're going to be doing at TMAC, is to not only during June, which is National Safety Month, but to continue and to try to educate our people, our communities as much as possible as to the importance of taking the precautions and the importance of taking safety measures, if not for themselves, for their family members. It's just, it's a little unacceptable as the injury and mortality rate we're having on the job sites. And this is something that hopefully, if enough people talk about it and we have enough workshops or webinars like this, and we can get enough people looking into it, at least listening, that we can maybe curve those numbers a little bit or slow it down, and that it's people shouldn't have to die to be able to have a job. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I say thank you very much for joining us. I've been your host on this webinar, J.R. Gonzalez, with TMAC, the Texas Association of Mexican American Chambers of Commerce. This webinar is brought to you in cooperation with Texas Mutual. And we want to thank you for joining us, and visit our website if you're looking for any other information on a variety of services and activities that we have. Thank you.